It's a great pleasure for me as President of the Academy to welcome you to this very important, very stimulating conference on genome editing.
Gene editing is a new technique which allows you with precision to either remove or insert a gene into the genome.
The human genome is the material or DNA inside every cell of your body, and that code makes the proteins and all of the structures in your cell so that the cell can survive well, can remain healthy. Now that we understand that some mistakes in our DNA cause diseases, and we have tools with which we can, in principle, change those mistakes, genome editing tools, then in principle we can make therapies for many different disorders.
It's an extension, broadly speaking, of what people would know of as genetic engineering or genetic modification. It's a way of changing the genes of any organism, which means we can apply it in principle to plants, to animals, to bacteria and yeasts, which are the workhorses of the biotechnology industry.
The main thing about generating new crops is diversity. So the more diverse, the greater chance you have to beat stresses, be it diseases, cold stress, drought stress, things like these. These are very important issues with climate change. So we typically use a more random way to generate diversity, which uses X-rays or chemicals, and that puts changes throughout the DNA of a plant. But what tends to happen is you get a lot of changes that you don't want in amongst the one or two that you do want. And with gene editing, what it allows you to do is actually just make a single change. So it's much more precise and much more accurate. Of course, it's applicable not just to plants, but to animals and to humans. So when you get into the subject of editing human embryos, that's obviously a serious ethical issue and debate. And that's why we're here today in the Irish Academy to discuss some of these issues.
Everyone knows probably someone who has a genetic disease, because probably more than 1%, or some estimates say maybe 10% of everyone is carrying some sort of genetic mutation that has an effect on them. These techniques can be used to, in theory, to treat patients and in theory perhaps ultimately be used to avoid children being born with genetic diseases. We're certainly not ready there yet for the latter, but it's something that needs to be debated now because it looks like it's going to happen at some point.
My daughter Dottie has an undiagnosed genetic condition, and because of that I'm very interested in genome editing. And even though genome editing may not directly benefit my daughter in her lifetime, I'm very happy to be taking part in research and to be talking about genome editing and being involved in the discussion so that it can potentially benefit children in the future with the same genetic condition as my daughter. I support genome editing as long as it's used for medical treatment and is also tightly regulated. People need to think more about what is treatment versus enhancement. I used an example earlier of short-sightedness. Is that a treatment or is that enhancement? And I think honest, open dialogue needs to be had with the patients covering this, and also covering how long research takes and how long regulation could take as well.
It shouldn't be up to scientists and clinicians to make the decision of how this technology is used. It's got to involve everyone, and by everyone I mean the public.
Society will be confronted with a large number of questions coming from this technology, and it is better to have this particular debate as to what are we going to do and what are we not going to do now, rather than when we are confronted with the situation that somebody in some other country has done it and then we say, gosh, we don't want this to happen.
We need to make sure that we minimise off-target effects. These were first identified over 10 years ago, but so much work has been done. And with one new genome editing paper published every 3 hours, every single day of the year, it won't be too long before we have the answers to a lot of these questions. The biggest thing is we don't get too arrogant. We're learning from nature, we don't control nature.